very, very serious economic challenges, not unlike that many other small island developing states faced at that point in time. We had a situation where unemployment had risen to 25.4%. Inflation was skyrocketing. The economic growth in Barbados has started to dip, given that in 1919 we had a growing situation. The industrial relation between the private sector and the government was bad. They weren't speaking to each other. The union wasn't speaking to government. The union wasn't speaking to the private sector. And our net international reserves at the central bank had plummeted to about 11 weeks coverage. Well, in truth, in fact, any particular period we would need maybe about 25 weeks coverage. So you can understand the precarious situation that Barbados found itself in. And like most countries that are signed on to the IMF relationship, we extended an invitation to the IMF to come in and provide us with some structural adjustment assistance. And they came in, they had conversations with the private sector, the government and the trade union, and they said, oh, what you all need to do is devalue the Barbados dollar. The government said, no, that's not a prescription for the challenges that we have. The private sector said no. The union said no. And you know, that one particular common objective brought the social partners together. And they said, look, our problem that we have here in Barbados is a productivity one. So we need to work together to address that. Otherwise, the Barbados dollar will be devalued. They put the IMF on hold, and they signed for the first time in the history of Barbados a prices and incomes protocol as part of the new way of governing Barbados, not government, governing Barbados. That prices and incomes protocol that they signed as a social pact had a number of conditionalities. One is that we'll freeze all prices. You imagine that? Whole country decided to freeze prices for a 2-year period. The union agreed in principle, freeze all wages. And there were other things that they agreed to, but one of the things that they thought that they need to do was to institutionalize productivity. It is not to say that productivity wasn't part of the life of private sector entities, or it wasn't the push or thrust by government to be more efficient, or it wasn't being encouraged by the trade union sector. But what they said, we need to institutionalize productivity. Don't leave it to chance, but have a structured approach to driving and enhancing productivity at the national level. And they set up the Barbados Productivity Council, the first productivity institution of that nation to be set up across the Caribbean, with a serious mandate. The mandate being to promote a productivity culture in the country. Very, very first mandate that was given as part of our mission to promote and create a national productivity culture in the country. They acceded to the fact that in order to do that, there must be a greater sense of awareness and appreciation about the importance of productivity. What we recognize and what they recognize then, that developed countries that prospered and developed countries where the quality of life of persons was very much enhanced, in truth and in fact, the productivity reality was part of their remit and life. America would tell you that the reason why their GDP would have grown significantly over the years is that technology productivity, labor productivity, work method productivity, system productivity was improved and augmented to the extent where that the gains created could be shared by persons across their spectrum to improve the quality of life. So that productivity awareness became part of the thrust. Having a deeper sense of understanding and appreciation on the benefits of improved productivity, putting in place productivity education programs, catering for all persons, persons at the leadership level, because there's something called leadership productivity, managerial productivity, supervisory productivity, and productivity improvement programs that would impact the behavior of persons at the support staff level in all organizations. Another facet that became part of the focus, so to speak, was the whole issue of measurement. Because we argue that if you're going to improve productivity, you must be able to measure it. A person don't know how much taller they are today unless they know how short they were yesterday. So the whole issue of having systems in place to measure productivity in private sector institutions as well as in public sector institutions became part and heart and life of the way forward. And of course, the whole notion of seeking out best practices, looking around to see and ascertain those things, those practices that were elsewhere and impacted performance that would also impact the productivity and performance of the Barbados sectors and economy. So the mandate revolved around those four pillars, so to speak. When the Productivity Council was set up, we were set up with several objectives, several key objectives that were defined as pertinent to the life of the institution to get the productivity culture and program going. One, the first objective was to create and develop methodologies for productivity measurement, management, and improvement in the public sector and in the private sector. In this regard, what we are able to do over the last several years is to develop an interest and a culture in all ministries across Barbados, to the extent where right now every ministry has to submit, before they get approval from the Ministry of Finance, a budget which is linked to performance. We call it performance budgeting, where the goals, objectives, the strategies are linked to the specific programs and outputs and outcomes that should be emanated based on the levels of monies that the government provide to the various ministries. Initially, that was a challenge, even though in law there's legislation to ensure that all ministries undertake that responsibility. But for some reason, that wasn't done. So it seems as though moral suasions tend to work sometimes better than the letter of law, in the law, so to speak. So right now, all ministries submit to the Ministry of Finance at the beginning of the discussion period for the estimates, a performance-related budgeting document which links results in relation to the resources being provided by the Ministry of Finance. And it's worked because what the public sector, what the Ministry of Finance will say is that over the years they have seen a reduction in the request for supplementary estimates, so to speak. Because we have had a situation many, many years in the past where every time you look around, a ministry is asking for additional monies to run their program in the financial year. So, in a sense, that has helped in our own fiscal situation. One of the objectives of the Council was to provide technical advice and assistance in devising productivity-related payment schemes. Remember I said earlier that when the social partners signed that prices and incomes protocol for a 2-year period, one of the conditions was to freeze wages. But somewhere in that arrangement, there was a clause that said if there's an improvement in profitability or productivity, then we can make some kind of payout to workers, which means you had to put in place methodologies, basic or generic, to measure productivity, profitability, and link those measurements to some parallel payout to employees in the organization. Initially, what we did, we were very basic in our approach. We used plans like the Scanlon plan, the Rucker plan, which we found in the literature, and people embraced them. We used concepts like the Entrepreneurship model developed by an engineer called Milton Finn, and people embraced them in the private sector in order to make some measure of payment a reality to employees who, where the organization would have shown an increase in performance and productivity. Initially, when we started the productivity program in Barbados, we had one commercial bank that had in place a productivity improvement program that paid workers a bonus at the end of the year. That was 2012. 23 years ago. Now we have all banks in Barbados make productivity or some kind of bonus payment to employees in the sector. We had a situation where the credit unions, none of the credit unions made payment to workers in the form of a bonus. They was just base pay, and if there was some kind of merit system in place where an individual perform well and he gets an increment, that's it. But now we have 35% of the credit unions in Barbados have some form of a productivity improvement program, and implicit in that program there's an element of productivity or performance payment to the employee. So what I'm saying, over the years, what we have been able to do in this particular regard is not only raise the interest and culture and shifting away from base pay increase, but among all sectors having emphasis on paying workers, paying teams based on productivity improvement and performance improvements at the enterprise level. What we did in Barbados, we introduced for the private sector a program which we call the Macro Productivity Indicators Program or project. And this is what we do. We survey organizations in each sector every year in order to ascertain the output per employee, the productivity levels, absenteeism levels, and also unit labor costs. Because unit labor cost is a very important variable when you begin to seek to track the relationship between productivity and cost, which again will impact the competitiveness position in the country. And over the last 12 years, we have embarked on that Macro Productivity Indicators Program, and all those 400 and something entities involved, what we are able to do, whatever statistics generated in relation to those 4 parameters, we shared with the individual company. And we also shared the industry average in terms of what is happening in the industry. So which means every single enterprise was able to compare how well they are doing in the year vis-a-vis what the industry is doing. And also just as important as that, that statistic allowed them also to track the changes in those output per employee, absenteeism, unit labor cost over the several-year period. So it allowed them to take a more proactive and practical approach to addressing the whole issue of productivity improvement and the challenges that existed, so to speak. So that program has been a real success. Actually, it started with an interest from the International Labour Organization that's based in Trinidad, where they were trying to get all Caribbean countries to engage themselves in this particular project in order to generate data of that type. And for some reason, the interest was not as it ought to be. Maybe the interest was not as it ought to be because there wasn't an institution to drive that particular process, so to speak. But Barbados, we have held our ground. We have been able to encourage Jamaica to set up a productivity institution, and we have worked with them in that particular vein. We have been able to encourage St. Lucia to set up a similar exercise. And over the last several years, we've been trying to work with Trinidad to get them to do the same thing. Actually, let me give you something that you may not remember. The first Caribbean country that actually sought to set up a productivity institution was Trinidad. In 1972, I think the guy named Neve Beckles, I try to remember his name, that's his name. He took the lead role to set up a productivity institution in Trinidad. And it was very good. But somewhere in 1973, oil prices went up, and somebody said, hold it. Things could be better if we just focus on the price. And it never, ever got going. We must understand that, or we must be reminded as technocrats, in any business, the relationship between to get to profit is revenue minus expenses. Am I right? The relationship between revenue, to get to revenue is really the outputs you produce times your price. Am I right? At the input level, to get to the expenditure is the inputs times your price. Which means the relationship between profitability revolves around a relationship between price recovery and productivity. So the focus seemed to be only on the price factor and not on the productivity, but it worked well over the years because the revenue component increased because of the price element. But I think right now we're at the stage where we need to step back and go back to basics and say, look, we need to focus a bit more on the productivity part of the equation. So in Barbados, when the productivity entity was established, we focused on those objectives, those three noble objectives that I mentioned earlier. It worked, and it worked well for a number of reasons. The Chief Minister said this morning, innovation, and he used another word, begin with I. Introspection. He used the word introspection. I think Brother Jack spoke about the importance of collaboration. What made the productivity program work well in Barbados, not only because of that initial focus on a common objective, but because the trade union recognized that they had an important role to play. Remember, wages were frozen in order to improve productivity. The private sector, umbrella institutions and entities recognized that they had an important role to play. So which meant that the trade union took it upon themselves as a senior partner in the partner arrangement to institute measures and initiatives to educate their membership about the importance of productivity, the benefits of productivity. So we had, I think I have the statistics there that showed for one particular trade union the number of educational sessions, the number of persons impacted in a 10-year period on an annual basis as a particular reality, a result for their own initiative. And that was one trade union. So what I'm saying is that the productivity enhancement thrust, even though the institution has a responsibility to roll out those responsibilities, the partner arrangement between the private sector, the government, the union understanding that have a role to play becomes very, very important, becomes a very, very important variable in the equation, so to speak. And I'll continue. One of the objectives that the council had, and still have, was to disseminate information to stimulate public awareness, which means we had to make sure we keep the whole notion and concept and practice of productivity in the face and minds and the heart of persons. Newspaper articles, call-in programs, discussions, annual productivity conferences and symposium of this nature to keep it going, because if you leave it to chance, it may fade. We also encourage the trade union to be part of productivity subcommittees at the enterprise level, because productivity is not only an HR issue, but it's also an IR issue. So we are saying that productivity bargaining should be part of the collective bargaining exercise and process, and what the trade unions were able to do when they sat with the various private sector entities to talk about wage increases, they introduced the discussion and dialogue about bonus payment, productivity pay. So therefore, the whole matrix in relation to the collective bargaining exercise over the years has changed. In other words, what was done is a consolidated and structured effort to create a climate in Barbados where productivity, because of its importance, became part of the mainstream of all discussion when it comes to profitability and improved performance. As I said earlier, I was going to devote an hour per year, but I had to reduce it. So let's talk about the national efforts in the productivity drive, right? Because I believe that a lot of these precepts and ideas are also very important to any effort on the part of the Tobago government to get their productivity program going. Social forces, government and its institutional mechanism, very important. Employers, managers represented by their professional association. What we did, again, it came back to the partnering arrangement. We recognized that the Productivity Council as a small institution, we don't have the capacity. So we sought consultants and professional persons in institutions like KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Waterhouse, Ernst & Young, to come on board and work with us and help us to develop productivity management-related programs that would impact the productivity of the private sector and the government in a big way. National efforts in productivity, the role of these forces should play direct intervention and participation, and that worked. Improve the quality of both workers and managers through productivity-oriented professional education, and that worked. And what the unions did to back up their actions in terms of helping workers to understand a bit more about productivity, they sent their own personnel on training. I remember Bobby Morris, the Deputy General Secretary, he was one of the first person to go to Harvard University on a 3-month course in gain sharing, understanding the principles of gain sharing, the basic tenets associated with putting a gain sharing program in place, which means the union had the capacity to sit down with private sector, well-trained accountants and entity to discuss the topic of performance pay and so on. So building capacity at the union level is a very important tenet in this particular equation. And I mentioned the importance of raising public awareness and productivity consciousness on an ongoing basis, so to speak. These efforts can be intensified and has been intensified through interfirm comparison, which is our macro productivity indicators program, regular social dialogues, in order to keep the partnering among the social partnership going, focusing on productivity. They signed another protocol from 1995 to 97 after seeing how the productivity program was working, and they signed another one for a 3-year period this time from 1997 to 2000, and then they signed another one. I think we actually into the 7th protocol. They recognize that the process of governance isn't one that should be left solely in the hands of the government, that the involvement of community-based organization, the trade union, umbrella organization as part of a path going forward to deal with the issue of productivity should be part of a way of life. They didn't leave it just to a 2-year path that was signed back in 1993 for that period. They extended it because they recognized the value. Actually, Professor Andrew Downs, who was supposed to come and participate in the forum, he and Dr. Lawrence Nurse did a paper reviewing the experience of the social path for the 10-year period 1993 to 2003, 2004. And what was very revealing in that analysis, is the extent to which it created some measure of stability in the country. Remember I talked about earlier the macroeconomic indicators that showed a very unfavorable position for Barbados at that point in time. Well, over the period, we had a situation where there was zero on industrial unrest. Because remember, at that point in time in 1992, we had a situation where every time you look around, there was a strike. There was some industrial discomfort. And over that period that we have signed the pact, except until recently we've had 1 or 2 upheavals and so on, but there was a high level of stability, and that has allowed and worked in favor of the country, especially when it comes to keeping the focus on productivity. Let me mention this particular statistic here, this table: number of sessions conducted, number of persons impacted by a trade union body, and this is represented here. Now, you will hear me keep emphasizing the role that the trade union should play in any national productivity drive. And you know, they have a niche market. They have the attention of the workers, am I right? So which means they're in a better position to say certain things that are positive to the workers. I'm not saying to say things that are negative, but to say things that are positive to the workers. So one of the rules that they agree in principle that they should undertake is that to see that a fair productivity gain sharing scheme is properly worked out and applied, which means if you're developing a performance-based incentive scheme for workers, it must benefit the workers fairly, because you can have a situation where you develop a scheme to pay workers a bonus, and somewhere along the line, the level of payout to the employees is not what they ought to be. So the unions thought that we need to be kind of an overseer in that particular vein. And it creates some level of integrity and trust, and that's very important in the system. Part of their responsibility to help build an organizational climate characterized by mutual understanding and cooperation, as I said earlier, to develop the trade union's own expertise in the productivity movement. When we started out, we couldn't approach it with a big bang approach because we didn't have the resources. What we did, we phased it at 2 levels. There was an introductory phase and there was an adoption phase, but a lot more effort was placed in the introductory phase on awareness building interest, having an indelible imprint upon the hearts and minds of persons on the benefits and importance of productivity and so on, because we recognize that that particular platform was key if we were going to move forward and provide technical assistance, etc., and so on to the various entities. Utilization of public relations initiatives such as essay competition, media coverage, technical booklets, newspaper articles, and so on and so on. Awards. Some person once said money is not is a good motivator, but it's not the only motivator. Am I right? So what we sought to do is encourage a culture where organizations would develop employee of the year, employee of the month schemes that are non-cash to recognize workers for some excellent result that they would have generated in the business. We did a research, I did a research this year, and I went through the newspapers. I got some student from university work with me to go through the newspapers to look at in any 1 year, those organizations that reported in the press their awards scheme. And I counted 70-something. And that's not bad. 70-something organization, plus there's some that didn't report, and plus there's some that report that the media may not have carried. So I'm saying that the culture of recognizing and rewarding workers for productivity initiative ideas and behaviors has become part of the life and culture of Barbados. And this is something that should be part of the drive at a very early stage. Let me conclude. There's a gentleman from Trinidad called George De Pina. Everybody knows George De Pina. He used to be the president of the Caribbean Congress of Labor. Everybody know George De Pina? He used to always say, if we don't swim together, we'll sink separately. And he used that quote on many occasions in several fora organized by the ILO, among the unions. Even when the Caribbean Employees Confederation meets sometimes, he would throw that in the mix. He said, if we don't swim together, we'll sink separately. It means that persons, the stakeholders must be motivated. I think the Chief Minister mentioned that we must be motivated to work together as a team and partnering for any productivity program. I remember a joke that was given years ago on the question of motivation about this guy who was very rich. This gentleman was very rich, and he had one daughter. And you know, a lot of guys, when they're rich and have one daughter, they think that maybe the guy who wants to marry their daughter might want to marry them for the money. So he got suspicious. He said, look, I want all the guys in the community who may have an interest in marrying my daughter to assemble at Crocodile Creek. You know, the name of a place tend to give some kind of impression. Crocodile Creek. And Crocodile Creek was a creek that had a lot of crocodiles and so on. He said, look, who is willing to swim from one side of Crocodile Creek to the other side because of their interest in my daughter? I will give them my daughter's hand in marriage. And not only that, I will give them half of my property. So the day in question, a lot of guys assembled by Crocodile Creek, everybody looking in the water and staring, and somebody said this is a good opportunity, but all of a sudden there was a splash in the water. And this young guy was swimming, going across, swimming. And he made it to the other end of the creek. And the old man came to him and says, boy, you must really love my daughter. I'm not only going to give you my daughter's hand in marriage and not only half of my assets, but I'm going to give you half of the balance that remain. And any other thing that you ask for, tell me what else I can do for you. And the young guy is sweating. You know, you can know the difference between sweat and water. He's sweating profusely, and he says, I don't want anything. All I want you to tell me the name of the person who pushed me in the water. In midstream, we can change objective, meaning this, that we may have a particular purview in terms of the direction that we want our country to go in relation to the productivity program, but somewhere along the line we recognize that, you know something, this particular objective is a turnaround objective. That guy saw a peculiar objective, and the old man recognized it. Pleasant words are as a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and health to the bones. I thought that before I wrap up the presentation, I think I have about 2 more minutes, right? 3 more minutes. Normally when I conduct productivity workshops across the world, I'm a member of the World Academy of Productivity Science. I just came back from Halifax from being involved in a major program with my colleagues, and they've agreed to come down to Barbados next year and focus on analytics, use the analytics there to help drive the information base to improve it. Very interesting. But when I do presentations, sometimes I say to myself, you know, you say all these noble things, you talk about the theoretical constructs and the practical applications and the impact, and people understand these things. But at the end of the day, I say, if I'm a professor at Cornell University, used to say, if you teach it, you'll know it. Which means that every time you hear something, you should always seek to share it. And that's one of the things that the Chief Minister mentioned coming on to the end of his conclusion. I tell people, look, you want to talk about productivity? Choose a word that begins with P, that impacts productivity from your own perspective. Embrace it. Share it. Articulate it. Argue about it. And you'll be surprised to know the extent to which productivity can become part of your own culture. Choose a P, whether it's passion. People should have a passion about the things they do, right? Pride. Principles. Pragmatic approach, common sense approach. Give me some P's. People working together as a team. Pride. No pain, no gain. You ever hear that one? There's a price to pay in addressing productivity. It's not something that happens overnight and all of a sudden 3% growth in productivity. There are challenges. No pain, no gain. I'm saying choose a P. Embrace it. Now don't choose Pilgrim. Life is a pilgrimage. We could at least look at it from that perspective. I hope the ideas that I've shared this morning in the short period of time would have argued well with your own perspective, your interest in ensuring that a productivity program and trust become part of the reality of Tobago. I like the opening statement by Dr. Mackenzie when she prayed, and that's another P. I grew up with my great-grandmother, and she was a very devout Christian. She born in 18-something. Her parents and her grandparents were part of the slave trade. She wasn't finished school at 11 years old, exceptionally bright woman, and she believed in praying about everything. I sometimes think that we have become so developed and rich that we don't pray about things, we take things for granted. We got to go back to basics. Nehemiah in the Bible, he was a waiter for the king, and he became a rebuilder of a mighty wall. I can't remember the full story, but he rebuilt the wall and the gates and things. He was a waiter. But before he did anything, he prayed. I think that that is something that, as part of any economic thrust and movement forward, we should seek to endeavor to do. And I was so encouraged this morning when I heard that note. I call that economic prayer. That economic prayer from Dr. Mackenzie stirred my soul. So Winston Churchill, everybody knows Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Britain during World War II. He was asked to give an address at one of his alma mater, his old schools, and he came there, and he came to the podium, and he looked at the youngsters, the headmaster, he said, never, never, never give up. And he sat back down. And the students looked at the headmaster as if to ask, well, is that the feature address? The headmaster said, yeah. But you and I know that we go to political meetings and we hear politicians speak and we remember some things and forget some things. But if I ask you, what was the address given by Sir Winston Churchill, I'm sure every single person would tell me, even if you add in an extra never. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your audience, your attentiveness. And I trust that the precepts and ideas that has been shared would become sufficiently provocative to stir your own thoughts, because I believe that there are a lot of other good ideas that all of us in this room have when it comes to the whole issue of improving personal productivity, team productivity, organizational productivity and by extension, the national productivity and priority. Thank you very much.